So good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us, and for those of you that are out on the West Coast, good morning. My name is Bill Coletti, and I'm joined this afternoon by my colleague Caitlin Carroll, who actually is on the West Coast. She's out in LA today.
Hello, everyone.
Hey, Caitlin, making sure you're there. Good. So thanks, everybody, again for joining us. We're excited to share our insights about critical moments and in the restaurant industry, risk mitigation and crisis readiness. This is a webinar as part of a series that we do on food industry issues. We've got a big crowd, a nice number of people that have joined us for the conversation, so thank you for that. Down on the bottom corner of your screen, there's a place for you to post questions. Caitlin's going to be receiving those questions, and periodically throughout the conversation we'll chime in and ask about those. So please post those comments in the question box, and we'll try to address those as we go, and hopefully built in enough time on the back end so that we can have some conversation about that. So as we said, we want to have a conversation about issues in the food industry, particularly risk management and crisis management issues from a communication standpoint in the restaurant industry. As a place to start, we asked some industry pros what are some key questions that we should focus on in order to do this. And so wanted to sort of outline where we're going to start with those key questions. What are we really interested in? So the handful of key questions that we're interested in is really how does risk impact your strategy, both from a communication standpoint but operationally? How do you define the three types of risks? And that's preventable, strategic, and external. And that's really the framework that we're talking about, that we're going to spend a good bit of time talking about. How do you understand who key audiences are, and how does an understanding of that framework impact those audiences? How do you use your CEO? Sometimes you shouldn't use them all the time, and sometimes you should, depending on the situation. How do you deliver those messages successfully and get to the right audiences? And then what missteps do you want to try to avoid at all cost? So through the course of this half hour together, we're going to hit all of those and try to make sure that we address each of those. And then we'll also have some key takeaways that we'll have at the back end and make sure that everyone gets an opportunity to participate in those. So the two key takeaways that we do want to talk about is talking about how reputational issues put company at risks, and they fall into those three categories: preventable, strategic, and external. And then we want to talk about how each category requires a different approach and a response protocol to each one of those. And we've got some attached documents there in the back, some cheat sheets that we're going to have for folks to use and take a look at. A little bit about myself as we get started. And so my name is Bill Coletti. I'm talking to you today from Austin, Texas. So previous to founding Kith Consulting, I co-led Hill and Knowlton Strategies Global Issues Management and Crisis Communications practice group. I've been doing this for a while, 25 years or so, working primarily with Fortune 500 companies. You can see there Cargill, Cracker Barrel, Target, Thai Union Foods, which is the owner of Chicken of the Sea. And done it both domestically and internationally on high-stakes issues management and crisis. And as I said, I'm joined by Caitlin Carroll, who's formerly a colleague of mine and is now with me at Kith, and she brings up sort of a very rich background from more of a direct media relations and issues management perspective, both in DC and now in Los Angeles. So I'm glad to have Caitlin here to join us. So as a place to get started, when most people think of crisis, even if it's certainly outside of the food industry, when they think about crisis, they think about the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. And while, again, not related to the food industry, it's really important when we talk about risk and talk about safety and security issues. And so Tony Hayward came in and was the new CEO of BP in 2007. And one of his vows was to make safety his top priority, the most important thing, and was really going to sort of be the hallmark of his CEOship. He instituted a number of rules that he put in place. All employees had to use lids on their coffee cups when they were walking. They had to refrain from texting and driving. And so he established a number of very concrete rules about safety and security. But what happened 3 years later, while Hayward was still the CEO, the Deepwater Horizon rig exploded in the Gulf of Mexico, causing one of the worst man-made natural disasters that we've ever had in history. And in the conclusion of that, the U.S. Department of Transportation and the Coast Guard had a series of investigative findings that they found out, and they attributed that disaster to management failures that were really directly related to the ability to get individuals involved to identify the risks they faced, probably evaluate them, communicate them, and address them. And so that's a quote from the findings from the Coast Guard and the Department of Transportation study, is that they failed to identify the risks, properly evaluate the risks, communicate the risks, and then address them. And that's hopefully what we're going to spend some time talking about, is how we could sort of do all of those. As we get started specifically about the food industry, is that in 2016, Deloitte Consulting with the Food Marketing Institute and the Grocery Manufacturers Association did a study about food buying decisions based on food safety perceptions. And one of the things that they found out is that companies should broaden their definition of food safety to manage and satisfy the expanded set of consumer expectations. And really what this creates is this critical linkage between operational, how we define food safety and how we manage it at an operational level, as well as communications, which is directly related to how we manage customer expectations. And so what the Deloitte findings really sort of calls out is there's this need to create a framework so that operational folks responsible fundamentally for managing food safety and communicators responsible for customer experience and customer expectation, creating a framework that so they can talk to each other. And one of the things that we've learned over time is that framework is really missing. There's no common ground of vocabulary. And so we're trying to suggest with the framework that we're going to be presenting next is a framework and a way to sort of share those and have some common ground for conversation. So these three categories of risk that we talk about, there's preventable risk, strategic risk, and external risk. And so this is the framework of how we're recommending that communicators and operational teams join and work together in order to understand risks affecting their enterprise. And so let me talk about these three very specifically. So managing risk is very different from managing a strategy. So a lot of us have been familiar with strategic planning in corporations and the ability to try to execute a plan, and that's sort of executing a strategy. Risk focuses on the negative. It's these threats or failures as opposed to strategies, which really focus on opportunities and successes. And so we're taking a little bit of a different perspective on that, is that we do need to focus on these things that can really impact the reputation of a company and impact its opportunity, its license to operate, and its opportunity to grow their business. And this is really counterculture to kind of this very positive, optimistic, can-do culture that most leadership teams try to instill in their companies. And they try to instill, as they're implementing strategies, is that we can do it, we can overcome this, really focusing on opportunities and successes. And so this framework forces us to look at things where companies can stub their toe, or in the case of BP, can really sort of devastate the company, and trying to frame that. So the three ways that we look at risk: preventable, strategic, external. First of all is preventable risk. These are things that there should be a zero tolerance for. They have there are risks that come from the company generating no strategic benefit from them. So this is a food recall issue, would be an example of this in the food industry space. There should be, they should be preventable issues related to foodborne illness inside the kitchen at a particular facility. Those should be preventable with the right set of rules, the right set of procedures. There should be zero tolerance for those, and those should be preventable in all cases. Strategic risks are risks that you take for superior strategic return. They improve the enterprise value. So this might be, you could think about it in the issues of sushi, for example. We've seen a lot of labeling in restaurants about eating raw foods. That is a strategic risk. That company is intending, or that restaurant chain is really intending to do this product, but they have tried to manage and mitigate those risks and communicate about it in advance so that the customers really understand that risk. So on the manufacturing side, these are sort of issues that would be related to what Cargill went through with a product called pink slime. They intended to make this product happen. There are other cases where Chipotle is an example of strategic, of where they intended to do things, and we can talk more about that. And then lastly is external. These are issues where there is uncontrollable, they're external to the enterprise, and there's really no value in them whatsoever. You need to try to just manage through them as best you can. The general example for external risks are related to weather, typically related to force majeure events, active shooter. We're going to talk about a different example of external related to supply chain that is a little bit external, and the company had very little that it could do about it. So those are kind of the three basic categories of risk. Before we go any farther, Kayla, I want to know if there was any questions or if there's any thing that I needed to expand on.
Yeah, there actually is. So if you wouldn't mind just expanding on preventable, specifically with the example you gave about food, bacteria breakouts, foodborne illness type situations, because in certain situations, wouldn't that be considered external? How much is out of a company's control versus how much is in a company's control? And are there any hybrid situations? Are some risks both preventable and external, or preventable and strategic? If you could just speak to that a little bit more.
Sure. I guess there are situations where you can have both, a little bit of blend together. I try to keep, from a planning standpoint, really try to keep them stark, really try to keep them separated. I believe from a foodborne illness standpoint and a customer safety standpoint that there should be zero tolerance for that, particularly in restaurants, is that there are well-established practices, well-established procedures. There is the ability to prevent these risks, particularly of foodborne illnesses, in the kitchens that you provide. There are practices, protocols, and procedures in place in order to do that. And so there should be a zero tolerance for that. There's not really any margin for error related to foodborne illness inside a restaurant facility. Now, there are supply chain issues that could potentially happen that are there, but even there, which might be external, it's external to the company, there even are some procedures, and we'll learn about that from McDonald's here in a second. There even are some procedures that can be put in place, and there really should be a zero tolerance, because if there's not a zero tolerance, that's when companies get in trouble. And if we look at Jack in the Box, or we look at what's going on with Subway, there have been some real things that have gone on that you should have a zero tolerance for. Thanks for that. So moving forward, the next issue that we want to talk about is sort of three very specific case studies. And so we'll talk about preventable for Subway, we'll talk about strategic related to Chipotle, and then external, the odd man out, external related to what was going on with McDonald's. Again, external primarily are force majeure events. These are events that are completely outside of your control, weather-related, active shooter, things like that. I'm going to choose a supply chain issue when we talk about external, just because it's a little bit different. So go through these relatively quickly just for some highlights, and then we're going to talk about how we sort of use the tools to move the process forward. So the first is the preventable risk, and this is a preventable risk with Subway. So the issue here was that there were some very preventable concerns about the size of the actual bread that was used. Is that there was sort of this social media issue, social media concern that was out there about that the 12-inch foot long was not 12 inches and was not foot long. It was more like 11 and a half or 11 in some cases. And so they had this situation. And so I think when companies make brand promises and when companies make statements, is that they really need to be able to have a zero tolerance. They really just need to get their facts right and really be able to articulate that. Now, Subway responded to this in a very efficient way, in a very smart way, and they fumbled around at the beginning a little bit, where they were talking about how they were, kind of blamed it on their franchisee because they weren't cooking the bread, which is done there in the facilities. They weren't done correctly and what have you, but they fundamentally got on that. So the point is that the preventable risks, these are risks that you should just have zero tolerance for. They're kind of unforced errors, if you will, from a tennis vocabulary, is that they're just things that happen that you just should have zero tolerance for. There should be rules in place and there should be procedures in place. And in that context is that a marketing or a communications person, in theory, could have said, are we really doing this? Are these really footlongs? And sort of understand and explain that. And at least at a minimum be prepared with rapid response, but also to be able to deal with it in real time if necessary. The next one is strategic risk, and this is directly related to Chipotle. And so Chipotle is an interesting case. So Chipotle has very intentionally decided to source their food locally. They've intentionally decided to try to source their food small, with small providers, as opposed to some of the major processors that typically supply restaurants. And that strategic intent, that thing that they intended to do, has caused them a very significant reputational issue. So where they've had a number of shutdowns in the Midwest, California, or the far West, as well as in New England. They had a national stand down for safety day where they really had to just really dial in on the food safety practices, both with their employees but also with their suppliers, and the ability to make sure that we're getting the right information. It's cost them a great money. It's been very expensive, but this is what they intended to do, and they meant to do this, and by doing that, they kind of disrupted the supply chain a little bit, and with that disruption, they created a point that put a lot of pressure and tension on some of those smaller providers and local providers that perhaps didn't have the food and safety procedures and practices in place that larger companies did. So that is something that is really sort of interesting when we think about it.
Yeah. Now, Bill, just to stay on Chipotle for just 1 second, from a communication standpoint, what could they have done to better prepare for that situation?
Yeah, it's really less, it's interesting, it's really less about, from a communication standpoint, it's really more of the communications team recognizing that there are these inherent risks and that they raise that up to the operational team. So it has to be operations going first. After the operations leading the process, and then communications can come in and say, okay, we have this risk. How can we prepare messaging that explains the protocols and procedures that we've put in place for our smaller and local sourced product? So the communicators really don't have the lead on these issues. They need to be following, particularly in strategic, because we intended to do this. They need to be in a position to explain and defend why they did this, and make sure, be a check and balance for the operational team to make sure that they have got this right.
Makes sense.
Good.
And kind of, yeah, just, actually one follow-up question. From your experience, what do you do when you've got an operational or leadership team who's sort of ducking their heads in the sand, who's in denial, and it's the communicators who see a potential problem? How have you seen that been dealt with successfully in the past?
Yeah. So I think, so we've got a slide that's going to talk about that, about, chicken with your head cut off, kind of or the sky is falling analogy. And so I really think what communicators need is this framework. I think they need a way is that all risk is not bad risk. Some of it is strategic. Some of it is intentional. We mean to do it. Some of it is external. There's really very little, if nothing, that we can do about it. And there are some things that are zero tolerance or preventable, so, no footfalls that are there. So I think having a framework like this allows the communicators that are really tuned into the public, the consumers, the brand, and reputation. It really gives them a toolkit, a vocabulary to use in order to talk about that. So what we found is that companies have this framework that everything's not terrible, but manages them into these three buckets, is that it creates a credibility with the operational team and the communications team to have a conversation. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a slide or two coming up. The last one is directly related to an external risk. And again, I chose a little bit of a contrarian one here with McDonald's. Again, external typically are force majeure events, weather, active shooter, things completely outside of the control of the company. And so this is one that's interesting, and this is related to McDonald's in China. Some of you may recall in July 2013 that they got some concerns with one of their meat processors in China was relabeling expired meat and then was using expired meat to make patties, hamburger patties that were there. There was an undercover investigation of Chinese TV that actually uncovered this, and so it is generally regarded that McDonald's is kind of the gold standard for supply chain management and really the sort of the best in class when it comes to supply chain. So the issue here is that external is that they had procedures, practices in place, but it was just kind of over there. And so this provider of meat that was relabeling expired meat and then using that expired meat to make patties, they really damaged McDonald's reputation locally. The media was involved. And so this is a situation that is external. McDonald's didn't do anything. Now, McDonald's controls that supply chain and is really good at supply chain management regarded internationally, but this is something that happened to them externally. And it's interesting the way they responded. Their response was very much related to, well, if this company can't get it right, we'll find someone who can get it right. And additionally, as they let the company do all the talking, or the other party do all the talking. And that's really sort of similar to an active shooter or a weather incident or something like that. It is typically a third party, law enforcement or the affected company, that does all of the messaging, and the company itself, McDonald's in this case, or if it's a weather event, the facility that has the tragedy, is that's really sort of the third parties are the one that manage that and manage that best. So that's kind of external risk. Again, weather, force majeure primarily, but here's an example of supply chain that it was external to what they were doing.
Bill, in your opinion, was that a wise choice? Was that the right approach and the smart approach to take, or should they have done something differently in terms of the response?
I think it was the wise choice. I think they had a long-standing relationship with the supplier. It was the Chinese division of a well-regarded international, highly successful Fortune 500 company. And so, I think they did manage it well. I think McDonald's took a beating, in that market, but I think they came out of it fine, and I think their supply chain issues have really gotten a lot better because of it. So again, much like an active shooter, much like a weather event, external event happens and then systems improve. Is that no rule in and of itself would have stopped a hurricane, no rule in and of itself would have stopped this incident from happening, but it really was a process where they did come out of it okay. So turning to the practical in the little bit of time that we have is that, so what you must do next. What are the things that you need to do next in sort of to understand this risk and talk about it with your colleagues? So what we really think, and Caitlin asked this question earlier, is why do communicators have such a hard time talking about this with their CEOs and their leadership? And so a lot of studies have really found that most people overestimate their ability to influence events. They think they can manage things, but realize that they're really heavily determined by chance. And so we really tend to be overconfident in the ability of our accuracy, of our ability to kind of forecast things, and we don't really understand the range of outcomes. And so CEOs know that, leadership knows that there are known knowns and there are unknowns and there are known unknowns. And so when communicators come in with this sort of everything is terrible, the sky is falling in a very sort of shrill reactionary way, that's a big frustration for leaders, is they know that there are risks, they want solutions, and so coming in when everything is terrible, the sky is falling, is really, it's not in the communicator's best interest. We think this framework of preventable, strategic, and external helps rationalize a conversation about risks and helps present a way to approach each one of them. The second,
Bill, do you think all communicators come in with the sky is falling approach, or is that just more?
I really don't. Yeah, I really don't. I don't think. I think a number have been criticized. As I talk to CEOs and talk to them about the challenges that they have with their communications team, it's true is that they do believe that sometimes their communications team sees horror at every turn and forget the fact that there are strategic risks. There are reasons why we intended to do something. We understand that it's risky and we know that it has implications, and that we can't just not do it because it underpins our business and it grows our enterprise. So I think that there are some communicators or some CEOs that believe that communicators are a little bit overreactionary. I don't believe that's all, but I do think that there are some that have that clearly have that posture when they go in and talk about risk. But having a framework like this really helps that process. The second thing is that their hands are tied. Communicators don't have an ability or a stake in the operational outcome to either prevent the problem, understand the problem, or fix the problem. Is that their hands are tied. They don't have a means of engaging, and so they're really kind of on the outside looking in, saying that's bad, that's a concern, I'm worried about that. And since they don't have a stake in it, those that do need to become their allies and need to become their partners at an operational level. And that's really to help sort of break those binds, is that the communications team really needs to understand the nuances of what it takes to run the company. The other last piece is what I've been saying all along, is that why communicators have a hard time is they don't have a framework. They don't have a vocabulary. And that's what we think preventable, strategic, and external is. It provides that framework and provides that understanding of why communicators can talk, or excuse me, a tool on how communicators can talk to their leadership. Trying to keep a little bit of time for questions on the back end is that in the materials that we'll follow up with you, we've taken these 3 categories of risk and we've offered some very specific recommendations on how they can impact your planning and how they can impact your ability to do some really important things that are in all good crisis communications plans. So that's messaging strategy, spokesperson, who are your key audiences, what are the platforms that you use, and then really always important internal communication. So we'll be sharing that with you. It's a very simple one-pager, takes the 3 issues, takes the 3 types of risk and sort of maps and walks through those 5 things to help you do some better strategic planning and crisis management that's there. The next thing on how communicators can kind of help their leaderships better prepare are a couple of very practical, tactical things. And so first and foremost is to use the tool that I just talked about and do this issue inventory. Organize them by category and then categorize those risks. And so that's a very simple desktop exercise where we can understand risk, and instead of having this encyclopedia full of concerns, break it down into these 3 buckets, and it shapes the prioritization. Is that I really think that you should focus primarily on the strategic risks first. I think you should focus on your your preventable risk second, and then external third. Unfortunately, everybody does that opposite. They focus on external threats. They plan active shooter. They plan for a data breach. They plan for these sort of high attention getting external concerns. Where most companies get into trouble is defending their business practices, and that's strategic. And so I really recommend that focus on strategic first, things we intended to do to make our company better, then focus on preventable, relatively straightforward, these are 0 tolerance, and then focus on these external kind of crazy Ivan events that can happen to you long term. And any good communicator can manage through in real time on some of those crisis-related issues. So first step is to do issue inventory and bucket these challenges appropriately. The next one is internal stress testing. And so in the banking industry, the way this is sort of mitigated, is the financial services firm use stress tests to assess what would the tripling of oil prices do, or what if there was a big swing or change in exchange rates? What would that do to our risk portfolio that's there? Restaurants specifically can do stress tests if their supply chain is disrupted, or if there's a very isolated social media issue. And so a internal stress test, basically what I mean by that is a desktop exercise where people sit together and talk about one very specific issue to make sure that the communications team is really ready to respond to that. So if we found out that we couldn't get French fries or what have you, how would we communicate that? How are these issues that are really core to our business because we're really known for our French fries? How do we manage that? That's a supply chain disruption or some sort of social media thing, relatively small, managed by the communications team. Next is bigger scenario planning. These are bigger, more robust desktop exercises that we do with a number of our clients of where we have created a external stimuli. We sit around and we don't do it in real time. It's really just more of a collaborative, external conversation about what would happen if this happened and if this happened right after it. Internal stress testing is really kind of a one-off. Supply chain or social media, scenario planning, and desktop are really more complex issues not done in real time and managed kind of in a very sort of more thoughtful, collaborative way. And then the third is actually a full-blown crisis simulation. And again, we do that for a number of companies where we actually will, in real time, manage the 4 to 6 hours of a breaking event. We'll time shift it a little bit to the beginning of the day, to the end of the day, so that people can really manage and understand that and feel what that experience is like, particularly the intensity of social media, because digital being digitally enabled has really changed everything for everybody. So that crisis simulation in real time really draws the communications team really closer together. Lastly is to bring in outside voices, is that we all fall victim to groupthink, where we think we've all got it taken control, and that can be consultants, your industry peers, your trade groups. Really valuable to bring in an outside perspective to share what their lessons learned and best practices that's there. And we found, particularly in the restaurant industry, a lot of companies really enjoy talking to their industry peers and trade groups. So Caitlin, we're going to start wrapping up, so if there's a couple questions we can hit those, but kind of the key takeaways that I want to leave with everybody is certainly the framework of what these three issues are about preventable, strategic, and external. And then key takeaway number one is that these reputational issues that we're talking about can put companies at risk, fall into three major categories. And those three major categories, as we've said, preventable, strategic, and external, is that you can manage risk. You can understand risk, and it's not just this boiling ocean of terrible things that can happen. They're actually functional things that can be managed a little bit more directly. And then the key takeaway there is that each of those risk categories require a different approach, and there are responses, and that's that downloadable takeaway sheet that I hope you download and help you use, is that those sheets can be used as a very workable tool. We've got a blank template on how we actually categorize these risks with our clients. We've also got that one-pager that I referenced earlier that's there, that infographic on how you can use them in your crisis planning. So, Caitlin, happy to take any last questions. We've got a couple more minutes before we wrap up.
Yeah, so great. We have actually have two questions. Bill, the first question, if you can just speak to it at a high level, and I know we're giving away the cheat sheet, but what the difference in the response is based on the risk? You know,
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So, generally I'll start with external first. So generally external, is that you need to put yourself in the herd. This has happened to other people. If it's a weather event or if it's an active shooter or it's a data breach, we are one of many companies that have impacted by this terrible thing. We are fixing it, and we are doing everything we can to get back to normal as fast as we can. Generally on external events, we find that people are empathetic, and they want to see you succeed, and they're kind of pulling for you and want you to get it right. So those are those weather, force majeure, external issues that are there. Preventable is you got to own it. We've had zero tolerance for this. We are going to get to the bottom of this as fast as we can, and we are going to fix this, and there's no excuse for this whatsoever. And so I think owning it, apologizing, and getting onto a solution is the critical thing that you need to do in preventable. In strategic, the issue that is really, really important is that if you intended to do it, you have to own it. And so you apologize for the misunderstanding. You apologize that people didn't get and misconstrued why you did this or why you did that, and apologize if necessary, but I really try to focus on this is the defense, is defending this. If the enterprise made a thoughtful decision in order to do this and they were prepared, the messaging around strategic has to be one of defending the status quo, defending why you did it. Now, if there is new information that comes out in a situation like that, you can retreat from that, but I think the official response should be one of very clearly articulating why you did it. You can do that with confidence if operations and communications have talked about it in advance and really sort of understand the pros and cons and the implications of these things.
Great. Okay, great. And then the other question we had was around consumer concerns. So as you mentioned in the study and also in recent news, studies have shown that consumers are increasingly concerned about food safety and health. Major brands recently announced, such as McDonald's and Mars, that they are and making smaller size portions, and some brands are actually putting on their products to only consume the product occasionally. So just kind of given these consumer concerns, how big of a risk is it from your perspective and experience, these more consumer concerns if companies don't do something about it?
Well, I think it's huge. I think social media has changed everything. I think access to information has changed everything. And if a company thinks that they can fly under the radar and not get caught is a huge mistake. And so I think companies that are recognizing, and that's a strategic risk when we talk about portion sizes, is that there are economic reasons why portion sizes are the way that they are, is that if they make a change like that, I think defending it, over-communicating it, sharing it on social is really critically important. I think transparency is critical. I think people want and deserve and need to know what's going on. I'm certainly seeing that with millennials that's there. But I think there's a fine line. There's TMI. There's too much information that you can share. But I do think there's kind of a nice, interesting balance that's there. But I truly advocate with our clients is transparency, authenticity, and the ability to communicate, why you're doing the things that you're doing so people can really understand it.
Great. Super.
Great. So thanks, everybody. We promised to try to keep this at 30 minutes. We've run a little bit over. Really appreciate it, the time that you've got. Caitlin, we are going to be sharing some of this materials that's there. We'll be sending those as a follow-up, the Excel sheet. That's a really nice functional tool to help fill your work on your planning, the cheat sheet, the infographic to talk about how messaging and internal communications and the like. We'll be sharing that as well. As also, you can download a copy of the presentation itself as well as the audio portion as well. So. Caitlin, thank you, and everybody thank you for participating, and we look forward to talking to you again.
Great. Thanks, Bill.
Thank you. Bye.